Nedbank has recently announced that its CEO, Mike Brown, is retiring this year, and I'm in conversation with him to find out what his plans are and to get his reflections on his tenure as CEO at the bank. Thanks very much, Mike, for joining me. And of course, we wish you all the very best in your future endeavors. But perhaps we can just go back a little bit and you can tell us stuff perhaps people don't know about you. Tell us a little bit about your background, your educational background, and where you grew up.
Well, first and foremost, we didn't announce that I'm retiring this year. All the bank announced is the start of a process to search for a successor for me, and that's likely to take longer than the end of this year.
Okay.
So just to get the facts out there.
No, that's fine.
But certainly if I stand back and look at how I started out in this environment, I completed my schooling at Maritzburg College in KwaZulu-Natal, and then went to university at University of KZN, where I studied towards a chartered accountancy qualification. I think extremely fortunate to have finished my final year at university as the top final year student, which I think gives you a good step in when you start articles thereafter. And I started at Deloitte & Touche in the Durban office. And again, very fortunate early on to be put into a grouping that was auditing essentially financial services companies in Durban. And that was the time, going back into the mid-80s, where many of the building societies were transitioning from building societies to banks and listing. And my main client at that time was a bank called NBS Bank. And I thoroughly enjoyed all the audit work that I did there, and that's really where my grounding in banking came from. I then spent 2 years working overseas, some of it for Deloitte, some of it doing my own thing. And when I came back to South Africa in the early 90s, a very short tenure back at Deloitte before I got an offer to join NBS Bank, which was my large client prior to me leaving. And really that was in 1993, and that's still the job that I have today. I haven't changed businesses that I work for. NBS subsequently merged with Boland Bank. All of that was bought by BOE, and all of that was bought by Nedbank. But starting out in a relatively small bank and then going through all of these mergers very definitely gave me a depth and breadth of experience that's unusual to get in a large organization. And then that shift, I sort of roll forward to 2003, where I was appointed as the Chief Financial Officer of Nedbank, and then 2010 becoming the CEO. But looking back over that period, certainly hugely grateful for the breadth and depth of experience that I had, but also the people that I was fortunate enough to work with early on. A number of people in NBS Bank, I think particularly of somebody like Paul Leafright, who I learned an extraordinary amount from. And then later on in my career, working very closely with Tom Boardman as he took over as CEO of Nedbank after a difficult period for us, and being part of the team in that Nedbank turnaround. So that gives you a little bit of a lens on my history up to becoming the CEO in 2010.
So, Mike, given the fact that you are here and you're not going anywhere, as you've told us and explained to us, while the process for a new CEO is underway, does that mean that you're going to be holding the hand of any successor that comes in?
Yeah, absolutely. I think being the chief executive of a large systemically important bank is both an extraordinary privilege, but also a huge responsibility. And I still fortunately have the support of board and shareholders, and I've committed to our board that I'm not going anywhere until such time as this process has been fully and diligently completed, however long that might take, yes, and a proper handover process has been completed.
So with word on the street that you are going to retire, some quarters are saying that Nedbank should have a black CEO, which would be a first for the company. Of course, that's probably not a decision that you have much bearing over in terms of your influence, but just give us a sense over the 14 years that you've been CEO, around your feelings in terms of transformation at the bank. Are you proud of what you've seen in terms of transformation at the bank at all levels of the organization?
Yeah, certainly. Look, I think we all know that transformation is a journey, and we're not yet satisfied with where we are, and there's more work to be done. But if you look back at the transformation of Nedbank over many years, reflected in one hand by our level 1 rating for 5 years in a row now under the financial sector scorecard. Not a great fan of scorecards as a measure of transformation. Transformation's much more about the look and feel of the place than adding together all of the maths, but it's certainly one measure. But we've also won, numerous awards. You may know that at the Top Empowerment Awards in 2021, Nedbank won Top Empowered Company of the Year. So it's certainly something that we're very focused on. But I think what's much more important for Nedbank than the color of the next CEO is ensuring that it's the right person.
Absolutely. No, that's a fair enough point. Nedbank is known as the Green Bank, not only for its colour, but also its credentials as well. But of course, being a bank that's based in South Africa and on the wider continent, how have you balanced the need to fund development on the one hand, which is crucial for the African continent, while at the same time, obviously ensuring that there's lesser investment in those investments or initiatives that are less climate friendly?
Yeah, so I think the challenge for everybody in the climate journey that the world is on, and South Africa's on, and Africa's on, is we all know roughly where we are today in terms of carbon emissions. So we have a starting point, and we know where we need to be in either 2045 or 2050. But what's not certain is the line between those 2 points. So certainly for us, we've got a market-leading energy policy that we've put out there that sets out how, on the one hand, over time, we want to decrease our exposure in lending into highly emitting sectors. But on the other hand, over time, we want to materially increase our exposure into green energy generation. And it really is that balance between those two that countries and banks have to run, because we have to transform over time, but you can't transform so quickly that there isn't enough energy to grow the economy. And that's really the balance that we try and run as Nedbank.
So when it comes to the green energy investments, what are your observations about the kind of investments that are taking place right now? We know that the private sector is heavily investing in renewable energy. What's your sense? What are you seeing in terms of your pipeline? And are you optimistic that there's going to be more of that going forward?
Yeah, so look, first and foremost, the energy situation that we find ourselves in should never have happened. It is an extraordinary own goal by our country and is the most material factor driving low GDP growth and continued inability to address unemployment. That said, we can't change our current reality. And right now, if you look at in that environment that I've just painted, most corporates are treading water, but anything to do with trying to secure their own energy future is absolutely an investment that's on the front page of every single board, or should be on the front page of every single board. And as a consequence of that, we certainly see extremely strong pipelines in many of our clients, particularly mining clients who are also large energy users and therefore materially impacted by load shedding. Really getting out the front door with renewable energy programs. We know those probably take 2 years, maybe slightly more, between conception and when you actually turn what we call PowerPoint into power. But there certainly is an extremely strong pipeline that we are mandated on in our investment bank. And I think Nedbank, given our green credentials over many years, alongside our market-leading team in energy and infrastructure, are particularly well placed to get more than our fair market share of what is a very strong growth opportunity in an otherwise stagnant economy.
All right, we promised you the second part of our interview with the CEO of Nedbank, Mike Brown. He shares his views on the state of the economy and the state of the consumer. He also discusses how he sees the current relationship between the private sector and business. This, of course, is after the bank announced that he would be heading a process towards his retirement. In conversation with SABC News' senior business reporter, Nompumelelo Siziba, Brown speaks to the issues of the country's macroeconomic challenges, also homing in on possible solutions. Let's take a look.
I think all South Africans desire higher levels of inclusive economic growth. And right now we are unable to achieve that. We have low levels of GDP growth and increasing levels of unemployment. That should be extremely concerning for everybody, as it is for me and as it is for business in general and Nedbank. So what are we doing about it? I think if you look at the recent initiatives from business, what you see is a business community that is proudly patriotic, a business community that believes in the long-term potential of our country, but is also extremely concerned about the key issues that are preventing us from achieving that long-term potential. And, you know, there's a long list that we can get to, many of which you have mentioned, but really what we've tried to do as business is narrow those down, at least initially, to three: energy, logistics, and crime and corruption. And business is working alongside government to do everything we can to help improve outcomes in those three critical areas, which we think in turn are vital for driving higher economic growth, investment, and job creation. Absolutely, there's a list that you can draw below those three that quite rightly include municipal services, the high level of fiscal deficit that we run, the water challenges, and also importantly, I think, the very poor outcomes from so many of our educational institutions that effectively don't produce outcomes that are easily employable in the reality of the world that we live in today.
So in the past, we know that you were one of the CEOs that piped up during a period where there was a lack of communication and understanding between business and government. We know that things have vastly improved now. We've got the Business for South Africa initiative, for example, where government and business are seeking to work together better. But the bottom line is, do you expect that we're going to see material changes as a result of these communications?
Yeah, I absolutely do. You know, I think what we know is business absolutely has a role as a trusted member of society, where we see things that are happening that we don't think are in the best long-term interests of the economy, GDP growth, and per capita GDP incomes over time, to call those out. But calling them out alone doesn't necessarily help resolve a situation. So at the same time, we have to put our hand up and be willing to help in areas where we can help. There's some areas that are not our responsibility, but in areas where we can help, to walk alongside whoever the government is of the day to create better outcomes for the benefit of all South Africans. I think that is an absolutely important responsibility of business.
So Mike, maybe you can reflect for us on what you see as some of the highlights and the lowlights of your tenure as CEO at the bank.
Yeah, I certainly, the tenure is not over yet. But if I look back on balance, an extraordinary responsibility and a most wonderful role to have had for nearly 14 years now, and definitely dominated by materially more highlights than lowlights. If I try and pick out a couple of them, and I'm sure I'll miss some, but I think, from a highlight point of view, I think the culture and values journey that Nedbank has been on for 15, 20 years and accelerated in the last 10 is absolutely vital for the long-term competitiveness of our organization. So the culture and values that we've imbued into Nedbank, I think, is an absolute highlight. The people that I've worked with, both on an executive team and from a board, too many to mention, but that's always a highlight. And if I think strategically, what have we accomplished, big picture things? Firstly, in that window period of 10 years, we've completed the managed separation from Old Mutual. They used to own more than 50% of us. As we sit here today, they own 2 or 3% of Nedbank. So Nedbank is a truly self-standing, independent entity, and we've achieved that in a way that we've maintained all our relationships with Old Mutual and their shareholders. So I think that's been a really key strategic move for our business. And then if we think about things that are important strategically right now for banks, front of mind for everybody is 2 things: digital and sustainability. And on those 2, I'm really proud of what we've achieved. We've taken the big hard step in a bank of a complete refresh of our tech systems. We called that the managed evolution. We started that in 2015 or 16, and we're now over 90% complete. That means it's largely de-risked. These are incredibly difficult programs to run in a bank, but we're seeing fantastic outcomes in client experience. So last year we had the top net promoter score of all banks in South Africa, largely as a consequence of that digital experience. So great outcomes from a client point of view. And I think that digital journey sets us up well for a future that's much more around data, artificial intelligence, etc. You need that digital foundation to be able to compete strongly. And then the other area of sustainability fits right into the energy conversation that we've just had, and Nedbank has been the market leader in funding government's renewable energy rounds to date, and I'm sure we will continue that market leadership position in commercial industrial generation as our clients generate more and more renewable electricity over time. So I'm really pleased around those 2 key strategic pillars, what we've been able to achieve. And then you also look back a little bit with pride on the awards that we've won as Nedbank. For several years in that window period, we won Bank of the Year in South Africa from the Banker magazine. I don't have all of the dates, but certainly 2014 and 2015, I know we won in both of those years. And on a more personal level, I think winning in 2020, which was an extraordinarily difficult year as COVID hit the banking sector. At that stage, I was chairman of the Banking Association, and in that year, to be voted by my peers as the Sunday Times CEO Business Leader of the Year, was certainly an amazing achievement for myself. And then some funner things like being part of the winning team at the Pro-Am at the Nedbank Golf Challenge 2 years in that 14-15 year period was pretty good to look back on. Yeah, lowlights. Thankfully, not too many, but probably I would look back on the death of our then chairman, Vasi Naidu, in 2021, after an up and down and long battle with cancer. Very difficult period for everybody, his family and for the bank. And I think, both our board and our management team walked that journey of the last few months of Vasi's life with him with incredible dignity. So albeit a low light, I think we really did do the right thing.
Now, we know you've emphasized you're not going anywhere, you're not yet retiring, but at some point you will be out the door. But just as you reflect on the consumer, how worried are you about the South African consumer? We know that people go through highs and lows, but right now the economy is at a low ebb, and we're hearing reports from various banks that people are struggling to keep up with their repayments. Impairments are running high and so on and so forth. What's your feeling about the consumer? Can they continue to be resilient?
Yeah, so look, I think consumers are under pressure and will remain under pressure. Banking, in particular, if you look at retail banking and credit losses in retail banking, they are cyclical. And what you know from many years of experience is that when interest rates rise, in particular, if they rise faster than anybody expected them to do, probably 12 to 18 months later, you will start to see that emerge in pressure in credit loss ratios. And if you go back to last year, I think all of the banks reported pretty low credit loss ratios, all certainly within target ranges. And certainly for Nedbank, we've said as that pressure emerges during the course of this year, we expect to be above the top end of our target range. I think the pressure will continue into next year, and hopefully, if by the time we get into the second half of next year, which is our current expectation, Inflation has continued to fall, and it has started to fall quite strongly in South Africa. If you look at the last few data points, we will then be in a position when the SARB will once again be able to cut rates, and then 12 to 18 months later, that will feed back into a cyclical downturn in consumer bad debts. But certainly for the next 12 to 18 months, I expect the consumers to remain under pressure in South Africa.
So, Mike, when the time does come, you're not retiring just yet, but when it does come, it will come. What does retirement look like for somebody who's been at the cut and thrust of the corporate sector for so many years? It's very hard to go from this kind of level down to retirement in the true sense of the word. So what do you think retirement will look like for you?
So I've deliberately not spent too much time thinking about that. I'm still completely and fully engaged in my role as Nedbank for as long as it takes until this succession process is complete. But certainly, when that day does eventually arise, I've been extremely fortunate to have had a hugely supportive wife and family who've enabled me to do this job, which is, an extraordinary drain on your time. And I'm very much looking forward to putting a lot of effort and energy back into family life and spending a lot more time with those people. My golf handicap has drifted out dreadfully in this role, so hopefully I'll be able to pull that back again. Yeah, and I'm still young with lots of energy. Still less than 60, so I'm sure there'll be something else I find to do on the commercial front. I'm just not applying my mind just yet as to what that might be.
Mike, thank you so much for speaking to us, and all the very best going forward. I've been in conversation with Mike Brown. He's currently the CEO of Nedbank, looking to retire, but he's not going anywhere until a successor is found.